Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Coaster 2, and welcome to Drachenblitz. This is a Intamin Blitz coaster with some swing launch action that I've made with the new Sorcery Pack in Planet Coaster 2, or at least it's sort of new. It's over a week old at this point, but this is just a project that I got inspired to work on. So without further ado, let's get into the time-lapse. Now, first of all, my apologies for releasing this video a tiny bit late. I was actually granted early access and access in general to the DLC by Frontier Developments, so I'm super grateful for that, and I was really trying to finish this ahead of the release of the pack, but unfortunately I'm kind of a slow builder and a lot of stuff was happening in my life in general, and then I also got sick, which caused me to delay this recording a little bit as well, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I didn't want to sound quite that sniffly on the video, so here we are a little bit later, but this video is coming out at last. Now, when I first got my hands on the Sorcery Pack, this was actually at the offices of Frontier Developments in Cambridge, and I just want to shout this out, not really as a flex, but just as something that to me was a huge honor to visit the offices and come and speak to the team of Planet Coaster 2. Especially because I really felt that from Frontier Developments, it was about reconnecting with some of the community members who play a big role in the game, and also just share thoughts about where the game should head, and also very excitedly show off some new stuff and stuff that's coming up that I can't talk about, but you know, hopefully in the coming months I'll be able to speak more openly about stuff again. But yeah, it's a huge honor to be invited to those offices and to also see the passion of some of the people working there, which sounds a little bit lame, but to be honest, I've been playing these kinds of games for all my life, and it all started with Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 for me. Well, if we want to go back, really Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 and 2, but when it comes to Frontier Developments and the games that I play a lot from the company, it's kind of way back from Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. And even some of the people who worked on that game and made some of the core mechanics of that game still worked with Frontier to this day. And on the office tour, we met some of them, and that was really cool. That's kind of like a childhood dream come true right there. And it's just, in general, so great to see everybody again. Not to mention that Ed Lewis was kind of the mastermind behind all of this, which was really cool because he's one of the first people I ever spoke with from Frontier Developments back when he still worked at the company in 2016. But yeah, that about my own life. Sorry I haven't been talking about the coaster as much, but we'll get to that in just a second. Just wanted to say that was really cool. And also, to segue back into this, we got a first hands-on experience with the Sorcery Pack, because in our very busy schedule over at the offices, they gave us a few hours to sit down at a good computer with the Sorcery Pack and just try it out and share our thoughts. And to be completely honest, I barely touched the game at all. Just being in this space with the developers talking about this game was just so cool. We just ended up chatting the whole time. And, well, all of us basically barely touched the game. So a huge shout out to Frontier Developments for making this happen, and also for the Lady Designer, Rudy Renkamel, Digital Dan, and Nerd Chacho for being there with me. It was a really cool time. Now, back to the coaster at hand. One of the things that I really wanted to try once I finally got my hands on the Sorcery Pack again when I was at home and I had enough time to play with it, was this new swing launch mechanic. Obviously, it's something that many people have been waiting for, and it's a really cool mechanic to play with. So, yeah, really just the thing that went through my head when I was doing this build is to figure out ways to play with this mechanic a little bit and also showcase the Sorcery Pack as much as possible and play with some of the pieces and get used to them. So, really, what's better than that? For that than an Intamin swing launch coaster where you can kind of go crazy with the theme. Now, my idea here was to create a coaster that's super compact and very dark ride-esque, very heavily themed, but at the same time, you know, not too outlandish, something that could realistically possibly be built in real life. As I am trying my hardest to get the shaping of this drop to be right, by the way, because this element over here was really tough to nail down. Not just the ascent, but the descent as well, with that weird part where it goes up into almost a half loop and then twists around, and you have a top hat section and then also a beyond vertical drop into a curve. Just making sure that the G-forces aren't too crazy on this was a bit difficult. And even in the end, this entire element hits just barely over 5 Gs for a small split second, so it's a bit on the intense side, but I think it's manageable eventually. But that took a lot of trial and error. I edited out most of my trial and error section out of this video, but this part was still in there. But yeah, my idea for this was a heavily themed Intamin coaster with swing launch sections. I know everybody keeps calling these things blitzes, and maybe this has been pointed out already. I haven't watched a lot of videos about the Sorcery Pack, but blitz coasters aren't really a thing anymore. Intamin tends to call them the multi-launch coaster nowadays. You know, it doesn't matter that much, but you know, if I'm being that nitty-gritty nerd right here, just wanted to put that out there. Also, shout out to Intamin, by the way, who, I don't know if any of you guys watching this are paying attention to the social media of Frontier, but it seems like whenever Planet Coaster's official page is posting nowadays, Intamin is right up there in the comment section, responding as soon as anything goes live to claim the top comment with some joke about how much they love Outamax. And I have to be honest, the Outamax name is genius and probably my favorite of the fake company names. And I am also living for the fact that Intamin is so happy about this entire thing. It's very funny. Also, another shout out that is gonna feel like a flex for sure, but Intamin sent me a calendar in the mail at some point, like an Intamin calendar with some of their newest rides on it, and they were just like, we like your Planet Coaster stuff, have this calendar for free from us, and that was absolutely crazy. I never imagined anything like that could ever happen from this weird little YouTube channel where I play coaster games, so thanks Intamin for the calendar. I really love it. I wish I could, you know, stay somewhere in the earlier months of this year for the whole year, because it had Danse Macabre on one of the thingies, but right now we're in September, and I believe we have a ride from, I forgot which ride we have in September. Anyway, doesn't matter too much. I'm going way too off topic. So, a swing launch coaster it is, but looking at this layout, you're probably wondering, you know, where is this going? It's a bit of a strange layout, and well, to be honest, you've probably already been spoiled by the first part of this video where I kind of give a glimpse of it, but my idea for this was to give it a spooky castle theme, which is very much what the pieces in the Sorcery Pack are made for. You know, for once I figured I really just want to first get to use these pieces in a way that they are supposed to be used, and then we'll figure out what else we can do with them in a kind of learn the rules before you break the rules kind of deal, because I also can't wait to see what else you can do with these pieces. But yeah, that was basically my my theming idea for this ride. And I had this idea in mind that swing launches might be really cool for some sort of indoor coasters. Now, I know these don't get used for indoor coasters that much because you get these big spikes at the ends of the track, which are probably kind of annoying to turn into some kind of thematic element. I think the only decent example I can think of an indoor themed spike is probably the one from, what's it called again? Psyche Underground in Walibi, Belgium, which is a Schwarzkopf looping shuttle coaster, which is completely indoors. Really cool coaster, by the way, I love it. Also, small little off-topic note, I recently watched the documentary The Legacy of Schwarzkopf by the American Coaster Enthusiast organization. I think it's just by ACE. Not 100% sure, but anyway, if you look it up on YouTube as The Legacy of Schwarzkopf, it's a really cool documentary about that coaster manufacturer and what their entire history is and all the different coasters that they've made throughout the years. Super cool to see, and a big fan. But anyway, I'm getting too off topic again. Anyway, One of those Svachkov coasters, I think, is the only example of an indoor-themed spike that's actually decently tall that I can think of. There are some other indoor tall coaster elements, like the tower from Kernan in Hansa Park, which is also super cool. But yeah, I was basically thinking it might be really cool to combine these sorts of ideas and apply them to a swing launch sequence, to have a completely indoor swing launch sequence where it seems like you're going through buildings and caves, and the sense of speed that you must get from a cramped space like that, and you can play with the lighting as well, I think would be really cool. So that was my central idea and starting point for this ride, and I think it fits into the theme of the very spooky-esque castle. I say spooky, but obviously the point of this pack was to be different from the spooky pack from Planet Coaster 2 and be a bit more, I guess, widely purposable. That's not a word. I hope you get what I mean. But yeah, I'm still going for a kind of spooky vibe with this one. And also, it was a nice opportunity to try and work with these new basalt rock formation pieces that we got in this DLC, which is something that I am kind of regretting a little bit looking back at this, because, well, I was figuring at the time the best way to go forward with this is to make some small basalt rock formations and use those to create caves, and it seemed easy enough at the time, but also this just goes into way too many pieces, and I once again am trying to turn this into blueprints. Part of the reason for that is because I just discovered that I like making blueprints in this whole Planet Coaster 2 career, I suppose. I was never really too much into making blueprints specifically, but there's just something about it's a limitation in a sense, you know, and limitations are usually good for creativity, or at least I like having some sort of limitations to work around, and having a maximum of 8,000 pieces really helps me to try not to make roofs out of 5,000 pieces each, and actually try not to feature creep my builds too much and actually make them manageable and finish them. So yeah, I'm still into making these blueprints, and I'll probably make a few more, but I am dreaming of making a park in this game at some point in the near future, and I'm already planning some ideas for that, and I have been for a couple months now, so at some point in time it's gonna happen, but for now I'm really into making these blueprints. But yeah, eventually I figured, you know, this is just gonna be way too many pieces, but it's probably fine, because it means that these launch sections are going to be very detailed, and I'm going to have these very, just highly detailed sections of basalt rock formations for these parts of the layout, and then for some of the other parts of the layout which you're not going to be able to see as long or as well, and I'll probably make them a bit darker. Actually, I know I'll make them a bit darker because I'm speaking over this past tense time-lapse right now. I can probably get away with some more simple rock formations using less pieces. So that's the strategy that I'm going for. A bit more detail in the places that you can see a bit better than some of the places that you can only see for half a second maybe. And for the places that you can only see for half a second, I came up with this way of putting the hexagon grid on the floor and then raising every pillar individually to make the rock formations that kind of follow the track, which is a little bit of a time-consuming process, but at the same time I thought it was kind of satisfying. Just instead of placing these rocks, just dragging them up and coming up with a sort of a formation as I went along. It was pretty fun to work with. Also, I was sidetracked a little bit by a little YouTube and Wikipedia spree about how these kind of basalt rock formations form in the first place, which I thought was really interesting. For those that don't know, it basically forms by lava when it cools down, and you get these big fields and blocks of basalt rock, and they cool down over very, very long periods of time. And the process that happens is kind of similar to what happens to a ground or soil that's super dry when it cracks and you start seeing these patterns at the surface. Those are the kind of patterns that you see in basalt rock formations at the surface as well, but they go vertically all the way down into the structure. And then when many more thousands of years pass and they are destroyed by winds and water and eroded over time, you get these kind of formations as a result, which is a really cool process. So I guess I learned a little bit from doing this coaster as well. That said, it was getting a little bit repetitive to do this kind of thing. So I didn't film the whole process. As a matter of fact, there is a bunch of stuff that I skipped over filming when I was building this coaster because, and this is a little bit embarrassing, my hard drive is full at this point. I have so many low-key unfinished projects and videos lying about that my 2 terabyte hard drive is completely filled up, and yeah, I had to be very cautious with which parts I recorded and which parts I didn't, and sometimes also throw away a little bit of stuff. So I hope I kept the most important bits in there. I really wanted to showcase the way that the rockwork works, for instance, but there are some things here and there which didn't make it into the final video, unfortunately. But also, fortunately for me, because it means that I don't have to talk for too long in one go, because I have to say these videos are completely off the cuff. I barely prepare anything, I just turn on the video and hope that I have enough to say about it. That said, I'm going to finish the rockwork all along the indoor section of this coaster, which is the first part, so that's after the first launch but before the swing launch, and that's still a pretty lengthy section. So for now I am going to skip the rest of this part of the time-lapse, because you can probably figure out what the rest of this looks like. I just keep placing all of these basalt rocks underneath the tracks and raising them up to create formations alongside the track, and trying to keep the piece count somewhat limited. There are even some parts where I stick with standard, straight, rocky walls instead, and just try not to light them too much. So yeah, that's it for how I did the rockwork. So I skipped forward a bit here, and you can see I finished most of the rockwork and also put a roof in some pieces. And I had to do this in some other spots as well, because as much as I like these basalt rocks, one thing to watch out with is that they do bleed light from a decent distance, which makes sense. I understand that they, well, it doesn't really make that much sense, but I understand that these pieces weren't made to actually build buildings out of, and it might have something to do with their relatively simple LOD, but whatever the case is, even from a decent few meters away they already start bleeding light, so some of these tunnels had to be extra tunneled from the outside. So there was a bit of work in that, but nothing too bad. But at this point, it was time to start building the actual building. Now, this is also where the castle comes in clutch, because it's the kind of architecture where I can just put big towers in random places to hide all of these swing launch sections. Because I haven't really talked about this, but I guess the layout is a bit weirder than just a regular swing launch Intamin coaster. Because basically what we're doing is starting off with a regular coaster section, and then you head into the swing launch section, after which you get into top hat. And then there are 2 more spikes that reverse the train. So first we have a section going forwards, then a spike inside one of the castle towers, and then we have a whole section where you go backwards, and then eventually another spike inside another castle tower, which is this one, which I'm building right now. And then you have the last section of the coaster going forwards again, with some final elements, also the one and only inversion on this coaster. Although I guess that depends on whether you want to count the top hats as an inversion or not, because it kind of, I guess you could make a case for that, but I wouldn't count it as an inversion. I feel like it's about as much of an inversion as a Stangel dive is, and that all just has to do something with the angle that you're actually upside down at. I would say you'd have to be more than 120 or so degrees until you're actually inverted, but I'm getting slightly sidetracked once again. I basically figured that the castle theme is perfect for hiding these big spikes, and you can also put these spikes in a very dark environment, which I felt like it would be cool to have a kind of coaster where it's hard to know exactly what's going on, especially if you haven't had time to really look at the layout, so that every time you re-enter this building, it's a bit of a mystery what's going to happen next. And it's especially handy because it really allows for a coaster that's very long in duration. In the end, this coaster has more than, I would say, 1.5 minutes of prime ride time, which is pretty lengthy for a roller coaster. But at a very small footprint, especially because most of the swing launch and reversal sections are all just stacked on top of each other. There are 3 track sections or track switches here, and they're all kind of stacked on top of each other, which allowed me to hide them all in this castle building, which gets a bit of a Disney castle Neuschwanstein kind of architecture, but a bit more dark and gothic, I suppose. Very gothic, in fact, because really the pieces in the Sorcery Pack are typical gothic architecture with their pointed arches and flying buttresses and all that stuff. So really good for making these kinds of castles, but maybe also gothic cathedrals and stuff like that. At this point, I have to do a shout out to Remnant, who made an amazing rebuild of the Notre Dame in Paris, which is really cool. That's one of the most unexpected things for me that came out of the early days of the Sorcery Pack. So yeah, it's a really good set of pieces, I think, for that kind of architecture. So yeah, really just wanted to give it a try for that reason as well. And the sort of Neuschwanstein-esque shape over here works pretty well to hide that top hat, because I just needed some sort of building which is a bit lengthy but could still be relatively thin, which I think is the case for the main body of the building of Neuschwanstein, I suppose. Also, now this is a flex. I visited Neuschwanstein in this summer when I was driving to Italy with friends to go on a big theme park trip, which was super cool. That was one of my bucket list items for sure. Seeing that castle for the first time in real life was really a core memory. Like, instantly, I just felt like, wow, this is one of the most beautiful views I've ever had. We also arrived there just at sunset, and this was in the middle of summer, so it was like 10, 11 p.m. Most of the tourists were gone. We were almost completely on our own, standing on that bridge high up in the mountains, looking over the castle and the Bavarian countryside. Absolutely magical. I've always been kind of skeptical of just how popular the castle is, because realistically, it's not really a real castle. It's just over 100 years old. Well, a little bit more than just over 100 years old, but it's much more new than it seems, and it's pretty much built by modern technology, but it's just a view that can't be beat. It's so good. So yeah, huge bucket list item for me and huge inspiration still for this build right here. One thing that also kind of inspired me, but in reverse, is that Disney castles have some forced perspective tricks that they use to make the castle seem bigger. So for instance, the more you go up on these castles, the smaller they make the floors, which is something that you don't really notice from a distance, but it just makes the building seem larger. But another trick that's commonly used is to make the colors on a building lighter as you go up. So if you take a piece of wall from the top and compare it to the bottom, it's going to be a little bit darker generally, or lighter I should say. And that's a little forced perspective trick as well with color. But for this building, I decided to do the opposite and make the top pieces darker than the bottom. So I'm trying to create a bit of a subtle fading effect where it becomes darker and darker as you go up. It's not really that subtle in some places. It's definitely very obvious here and there. But overall, it's an effect I think that works for this kind of more gloomy, spooky build. And I wasn't too concerned about the forced perspective here. Which, by the way, speaking of scale, this building is a little bit over 60 meters tall, which I do realize the tallest Disney castle, which I believe is the one in Shanghai, is just under 60 meters tall, and the same also usually goes for the Tower of Terror buildings, because supposedly that's the point where they would need to add the warning lights for airplanes, which makes sense, you know, and having to put a light like that on your building kind of ruins the immersion. So the first version, or not really the first version, but there was a version that I messed around with for this build, for this castle, was one that was also just below 60 meters. It's very doable, it's very possible, but looking at it, I just thought, it's not quite the right composition. So I made the turret on the side of the main building a little bit taller, so it's over 60 meters. And in real life would probably have to add a warning light, which is unfortunate for me, I guess, because I decided to skip the realism in this case. Besides, I know this is the case for the Orlando parks, but I don't know what the aviation airspace rules are in different countries. So yeah, at this point, I just thought to myself, why am I even slightly downgrading my castle to, you know, keep track of airspace? This is a computer game after all. And then I just made the turret a tiny bit taller. So, alas, my castle couldn't be built this way in, let's say, for instance, Disney's Magic Kingdom, or it would have a little blinking red light at the top. But it is what it is. I like it a bit more this way. Now, I skipped quite a bit of building section here, and I talked some off-topic stuff through it as well. But basically, the setup for this castle is we have the main building, and then we have a separate tower which hides 2 swing launch spikes. And between that, we have a wooden bridge that was kind of inspired by Hogwarts, where they have that really cool wooden bridge as well. And yeah, that's basically the setup. That's basically the way to hide all of the swing launch and backwards and spike action going on this coaster. And then right in front of it, I decided to put a pretty simple entrance gate to the dark ride section of the coaster. You know, I figured it's nice to show off the coaster a little bit outside before you head into the, ooh, what's gonna be in there kind of caves. And then we have the station as well, which funnily enough is in the open air, which considering the fact that most of the coaster is actually indoors, but the station isn't, I feel like that doesn't really happen in real life. But then again, I see no reason that it couldn't happen, because there are definitely some coasters with outdoor stations like this, and this was a little bit inspired by the station of the Swarm in Thorpe Park, which also has an open, ruined kind of gothic theme to it, which is a really cool station. I thought I'd hate it being outdoors and all, and I'm not sure if it's the most practical option, but given the fact that it has a kind of post-apocalyptic theme, the fact that there's no roof makes a lot of sense. With this building though, I just thought this station made most sense, because I wanted something that was alright to look at, but wouldn't distract too much from the castle in the background, which I think is really the architectural star of the show here. And also I wanted to have a station which could have some interesting interaction with the 0G roll going over the station, and having this sort of arch thing going on was the best way to make that happen, I think. Now this is basically it for the blueprint section of this build, save for a couple things that I added later as well. But at this point, there was something else that I wanted to try, and that is to give this blueprint some context and something that I could make a video around and make some cinematic shots. Kind of like I did for Poltergeist back in the day, I suppose. And in a bit of a simpler way some of my other blueprints as well. But for this one, I wanted to try something new and actually make it look like we're somewhere at sea in some sort of archipelago, and actually do a bit more with the basalt rocks as well. So this is what I ended up going for. We're on a tropical map, but let's not talk about that. This is the only way that I found to get this thing out on an ocean map. And, you know, being this far away from the trees, you can hardly tell that they are sort of tropical trees, I hope. I really shouldn't just have said this and just see if people start to notice. Anyway, I think it works well enough in this case, and at this point I decided to just copy some rocks around It's not really the most clean way of doing this. It's really just slapping a bunch of these rocks together and trying to make it work with some bushes and some elbow sweat. But yeah, if you don't look at it too long, I think it works alright. It also creates a really cool effect in bad weather, I realized later on, because I don't know, the devs really cooked on the water thing going on. Whenever you get shallow water and there are waves, they really start breaking the waves. And the same also happens if you put your rocks just over the terraforming. So you get some actually pretty cool animations of the water slamming into these rocks, which I'll show off in a second. So all in all, I think it worked out alright, and I just managed to save a lot of time by copying all of my rocks from elsewhere in the build. This also made me realize just how piece heavy these rocks are though, so if you do intend to use these rocks in a way that kind of mimics the way that they look in real life and also use that for a pretty big area, do keep in mind that you're gonna go into the thousands of pieces. After I did all of this rock work, plus the blueprint itself, we're at way over 15,000 pieces for just this island alone, which I think is fine for a standalone build like this, but if you build a whole park, it might get a bit intense. Also, I have to say, one of the first things that I thought when I was playing the Sorcery Pack at the Frontier Development's offices, and I did have a little bit of time between the conversations to look at the pieces, when I saw this rock, I just couldn't help but think of Terran in Phantasialand immediately. I really hope that some genius somewhere in the community has decided to take it upon themselves to recreate Terran. Although that's a bit of a selfish hope as well, because I also hope that for their own mental well-being, nobody wants to pursue this, because this is an absolutely crazy job. So, yeah, no, I don't recommend doing this, but these rocks would be perfect for a Terran recreation, and it would be so cool to see how they could get used for something like that. Maybe even just something similar, where you use them in a similar way, where they kind of curve around and create these really strange compositions. Because in this case, you know, in terms of this build right here, I just put them all straight, which is kind of how they usually appear in real life as well. But Terran in Phantasialand did some super cool inventive stuff with these kinds of rocks. So yeah, I think these pieces lent themselves very well for that kind of thing. But here I just kept everything pretty simple and just slapped a bunch of these rocks everywhere and called it a day. So yeah, that's basically it for the time-lapse. There's a bit of finishing work that I did off camera as well, but you know what? I'll just show that off in a quick real-time section where we can see what the coaster looks like. So here we are. Here's the final results, and some other stuff that I added is a little name sign over here, as well as this building to hide the place where the guests come into the park, which is something I had to do given the fact that we are on an island right here. But yeah, look at some of these animations, by the way, at the rocks. I think they're really cool, and I really can't claim any credit for that. That's all Frontier's doing, really. And this is the general look of the coaster. Now, we can't really see the coaster go around right now because it's doing its thing somewhere in these tunnels right here. And given the sun position, it's kind of really glaring into this tunnel, which just happens to be because the position of the sun is kind of low with this, but I do like the lighting with this. But yeah, these are some of the indoor sections. Quick spoiler right here, and we have some lights to light this whole scene up when the coaster passes by. Speaking of the coaster passing by, I think we should be able to catch it go around right now. Yeah, there it goes. So this is one of the later sections where it enters the building and then does a little spike indoors, and then it flies through the station right here for the last section of the ride. And really, one of my favorite parts of this build to do was this bridge over here, which is a completely straight section of track. Must be kind of boring from a coaster perspective, but I feel like with the theming, it's actually a unique element that must be really cool, looking out over the landscape from such a height. And then, of course, we also have this drop over here. And the fact that it really hides a top hat, which is something that you can barely even see when you look at it from the outside here. And yeah, that's all you can really see from the outside. Now on the inside, there are some decorations that I hid as well. So we have loads of gems over here in this tunnel. And then when we go into the switch track section and the swing launch sequence, we have, ooh, there it goes. The train going through this rocky cavern and then all the way up the spike. And yeah, I think that's it. So we should be able to catch it outside going through the bridge over there. Oh man, that's such a view if you're down here at the paths looking at the coaster doing that maneuver. But yeah, that's basically all of the indoor theming. So not much of a story or anything going on. I just try to create some cool vibes down here. And then we also have this section over here, which is basically a giant helix, as well as this curve. And this segment here actually has some decent airtime. The stats are something that I really tried to pay attention to this time. So if we look at, for instance, the final statistics, we have the one section which just goes over 5 Gs on the top hat. But we also have some decent ejector airtime, I think. Not the most strong ejector airtime ever on an Intamin, but the top hat doesn't have as much airtime because I decided to trim it at the top, which is something that a lot of these modern multi-launch Intamin coasters tend to do. And I think with the anticipation of dropping out of this tower, it's probably more fun than having crazy ejector. And then some of the other airtime moments are indoors as well as backwards. So I think it's fair enough. And yeah, that's basically all that I wanted to say about this ride before I head off into the cinematic shots. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and maybe it gave you some ideas of stuff to work on. For me, it was a lot of fun to work on in any case, and I'm really enjoying the Sorcery Pack. So without further ado, I'll say goodbye, and I'll leave you with some cinematic shots and a POV. Thanks for watching, everyone.